have 106 felony jury trials, and he thinks that's good, but these people are all guilty. Let me give you a little brief history. It's hard for me to be too brief. No one's ever accused me of being short-winded, but let me give you a little brief history behind the book. When the Supreme Court came out with their ruling on December the 12th, I, along with millions of other Americans, certainly everyone in this room, just outraged at what the court had done. And then when I started reading the opinions or the commentary by the legal critics and the law professors around the country, it was very obvious that the overwhelming majority of them were highly critical of what the court did. They said the court's ruling was dishonorable, and they all used the word politically motivated. And up to that point, I agreed completely with what the legal critics said about the court's ruling. Where I completely departed from the critics, the court's ruling, was when they went on to say, I want to put this thing up just a little more here, okay. When they went on to say that because of the court's ruling, they had only lost respect for the court, lost confidence in the court, and the court had lost credibility in their eyes. And it was at that point I said, wait a while, folks, wait a while. You mean that you can steal a presidential election and your only retribution is that some people don't have as much respect for you, as much confidence in you? I mean, that's like telling Timothy McVeigh, don't worry, Tim, we're not going to hurt you, we're not going to punish you, but, we don't respect you as much anymore. We don't have as much confidence in you. If indeed the court's ruling was politically motivated, which it unquestionably was, then this means that it was not based on the law.
Right.
And if it was not based on the law, this means that these justices deliberately and knowingly nullified the votes of 50 million Americans who voted for Vice President Gore and stole the election for George Bush. Nothing could be more serious in its enormous ramifications. And the stark reality, and I say this with every fiber of my being, is that the institution that Americans trust the most to protect their freedoms and their principles committed one of the biggest and most serious crimes in American history when they stopped the recount in Florida, took the election away from the American people, and handed it to George Bush. And in a fair and just world, the 5 justices responsible for that deserve to be behind bars as much as any American white-collar criminal who ever lived. The interesting thing is people call in on shows to me and they say, that's so severe what you're saying.
They don't get it.
And I say to them, are you aware that people have been executed in this country for doing things infinitely less serious than these people did? The only issue is not what I'm recommending for punishment. The issue is whether what I'm saying is true. That's the whole issue. And if it is true, how can anyone say it's too severe that these people should be incarcerated for the rest of their lives? I'm looking at some notes here because I was told to summarize the entire book in a couple of words.
Read it.
So in any event, I decided to write an article for The Nation. I called the editor of The Nation, and I said, I want you to step up to the plate with me on this. It's going to be very, very hard-hitting. I think the typical magazine would not publish it. Victor Navasky says, Vince, I'm with you. He says, try to keep it down to 3,500 words. I said, Victor, I can't even say hello in 3,500 words. So I think I wrote about 6,500 words. The Nation's the oldest magazine, I guess, in America. I didn't even know that before, that I knew it was an old magazine, but it dates all the way back to 1865, the last year of the Civil War. And they said, the editor said that the article got the biggest response that they'd ever gotten in the 136-year history of the magazine. So they asked me to write a book around the article, and I agreed to stop working on my 2-volume tome on the Kennedy assassination, and I wrote The Betrayal of America, attacking these justices very, very severely. Let's just briefly talk about some of the evidence against them, and there's an enormous amount of evidence against them. In fact, I can tell you this, there's no evidence pointing towards innocence. All the evidence points towards guilt. No, I mean that. I mean, this is not a close case. How do you defend these people? when they themselves, in so many words, in effect, have confessed to the crime. Now, how did they confess?
Yes.
Give me 30 seconds and I'll try to summarize it for you. They confessed to the crime by necessary implication. When they said that their ruling, that different standards to count votes in Florida, violates the Equal Protection Clause, only applied, they said, to Bush v. Gore, not to other cases. Now, if their ruling set forth a valid legal principle that was good enough for Bush v. Gore, why wasn't it good enough for other cases? This is the first time in the 210-year history of the court that the court limited its ruling to the case before it, saying it did not constitute legal precedent for any other case. And that fact alone, and there's much more evidence in the Betrayal of America, but that fact alone and all by itself clearly and unequivocally shows that these 5 justices were up to no good. That they knew their ruling, they themselves knew that their ruling was bogus and fraudulent and only a means to hand the election to George Bush. Because if their ruling was based on the law, there's no reason under the moon why they would have said it did not apply to any other case. Now, they showed that they were up to no good earlier than that. December the 8th, Florida Supreme Court, under Section 102.168 of the Florida Election Code, ordered, as you know, a manual recount of all the undervotes in the state of Florida, all 67 counties. We're talking about 60,000 undervotes. You folks know what an undervote is. These are the votes that, for whatever reason, are not picked up by the vote-o-matic machine, and you have to look at them visually to see if there's a clear indication of the intent of the voter. So the recount starts Saturday morning, December 9th, 8 o'clock. Bush's lead over Gore had shrunk to 154 votes at that point. At 2 in the afternoon, Justice Scalia steps in, Antonin Scalia. This is what he said. I'm not making this up. You can't make up stuff like this. It's just too far, well, just too far out. You can't make up stuff like this. And he said, we've got to stop this recount because if it continues, it could quote, these are his exact words, threaten irreparable harm to George Bush. So even though the election had not yet been decided, the incredible Scalia, and there's no other adjective I can use to describe this fellow, the incredible Scalia was presupposing that Bush had won the election, indeed had a right to win it, and any recount that showed that Gore had won would threaten irreparable harm to George Bush. Now, if that doesn't show that these justices were up to no good in stealing the election for George Bush, what in the world would? And for people that challenge me on that, I say, well, let's hypothesize a reversal of roles, i.e., Gore's ahead by 154 votes Saturday morning, December 9th, 8 o'clock. Would Scalia have done the same thing for Gore that he did for Bush? Now, who is Scalia? Well, Scalia is not a typical Republican or a typical conservative. He's a right-wing ideologue of the Rush Limbaugh school. He's the darling, the judicial darling of the far right. It is absolutely inconceivable that Scalia would have stepped in and said, we've got to stop this recount because if it continues, it could cause irreparable harm to Al Gore. That would not have happened. That could not have happened. And anyone who can tell me with a straight look on their face that that would have happened, I will personally nominate them for an Academy Award. Anyone who can imagine something like that happening, I suppose, could also imagine seeing someone jump away from their own shadow, or Frenchmen no longer drinking wine. I mean, come on, that would not have happened. Now, what does it mean when we say it's obvious that Scalia would not have done for Gore what he did for Bush? Well, what it means, obviously, is that the decision was not based on the law, because if it was based on the law, it should apply equally to both parties. And many legal conservatives, by the way, trying to retain their credibility in the legal community, have attacked the ruling, but they've come up with another rationale for saying that what the court did is okay, which maybe we can get into during Q&A. But let me just cite one person who's attacked the ruling. Terrence Sandalow, former dean of the University of Michigan Law School, judicial conservative, opposed Roe v. Wade, supported the nomination to the court, a right-wing icon, Robert Bork, talking about what Scalia did, said it was, quote, incomprehensible. And it was an unmistakably partisan ruling that had no foundation in law, unquote. Let me go back to that equal protection argument that the court based their ruling on. Now, number one, like I told you, they themselves did not believe in it. We know that because if they believed in it, they would have applied it to other cases. But I want to examine it a little further just to show you how fallacious and sophisticated it really was. Nothing but a legal gimmick to hand the election to George Bush. What evidence could there possibly be, empirical, anecdotal, or otherwise, that different standards to count votes in Florida would hurt George Bush more than Al Gore? How could there possibly be any evidence to support that proposition? All anyone could say was, well, I just have a gut feeling that it's going to hurt Bush more than Gore. The Bush legal team, in oral argument and briefs before the court, never even made that allegation. That allegation was never made. And if the court wasn't concerned about George Bush, but about the voters themselves, as they so fervently claimed to be, then under what conceivable theory would they, in effect, tell these voters, we're so concerned that some of you undervoters may lose your vote because of the different standards to count votes in Florida, that we're going to solve the problem by making sure that none of you undervoters have your votes counted. They threw out all 60,000 undervotes. 60,000 Floridians did not have their votes counted. So in effect, the U.S. Supreme Court told 60,000 Americans, we're going to protect your right to vote by not counting any of your votes. So we're just talking about a legal gimmick, nothing more, nothing less than a legal gimmick, and that an election for an American president can be stolen by the highest court in the land under the deliberate pretext of an inapplicable constitutional provision has got to be one of the most dangerous and frightening events ever to have taken place in this country. And when people tell me they're not frightened by it, I say, well, man, sir, you should be. You certainly should be frightened by it. Because this is not the sunlight of democracy. This is the dark and ominous shadows of totalitarianism, despotism, fascism. People have asked me, and then this is the question and answer, but they asked me, why did I write The Betrayal of America? Well, like most people, I like to think that I have a sense of justice. And in my mind's eye, these people have gotten away with murder. Yes. And I want to do everything within my power to make sure that they pay dearly for their crime.
Yes.
I want Scalia and Thomas et al. To know, I want to remind them, because apparently they've forgotten, that this is America, not a banana republic. Right. And in the United States of America, you simply cannot get away with things like this. Everyone is concerned about their legacy. And I want the verdict of history to be that these 5 justices are among the most serious criminals, if not the greatest criminals in American history. I want the message of the betrayal of America to get out to such an extent that when these 5 justices are at cocktail parties in Washington, D.C., and they're talking to someone, I want the thought to enter their mind, I wonder if this person has read The Betrayal of America and thinks that I belong behind bars. Most importantly, by exposing this terrible, terrible crime, I want to help ensure that something like this never, ever happens again in America. If the court here, if the Supreme Court had ruled in a manner consistent with its own prior rulings and judicial philosophy, they never would have ruled the way they did. And you just gave one example. These are states' rights advocates, right? Mm-hmm. And the court has said over and over again, we let state courts interpret state law. So if they'd followed their own declaration and their own judicial philosophy, they would have stayed the hell out of Florida's business. They couldn't afford to do that here, because if they did, they knew there was a very decent possibility that their guy, George Bush, would not become president. As far as the other thing you're talking about moving on, did you say that?
The Democrats say the election is over, move on.
But the main people that are responsible for that are the media, a group that can always be counted upon to do a minimum of thinking. And the people, and maybe that's true around the world, they follow the media, and the media's position on this, I'm sure you probably know, is that my publicist talks to the media all the time, and keeps coming back every day. Tell Mr. Bugliosi, we respect him, but the election is over with. The election is over with. We've gone on to covering other matters. Now, mind you, this is not in defense of President Clinton, but this is the same group of people that pursued President Clinton, not just day after day, not just week after week, not just month after month, but year after year, for lying about a private consensual sexual affair. And here we're talking about the theft of the presidency. And they say, the election is over with.
What else can they say?
Covering other matters. That would be like the Nazi war criminals
Their
in
only
Nuremberg
defense.
saying, the war is over with, let's get on with our lives.
Let's follow orders.
Come up with another argument that's kind of gotten hold, and it's coming to me all the time now on radio talk shows. The host is asking me this. They realize the equal protection argument is silly, it's just pure moonshine on its face, and they say that. But then they go on to say, and I'm sure some of you folks have heard this, they go on to say this, they say, well, the court had to do what it did to, quote, avoid or avert a constitutional crisis. Have you heard that argument? Now let me give you the precise translation of that. I'll give you the precise translation. The translation is this. If there's an election for president that's not close, then the court doesn't have to intervene. But if it's bitterly close, as all close elections are, then this is the exact translation. Then it's better for the United States Supreme Court to pick the president, whether or not he won the election, than to have the dispute resolved in the manner prescribed by law. Now, even if you wanted to accept such mindless bilge, how would you do it without first tying up and gagging your intellect? What is the manner prescribed by law? We all know that. 12th Amendment, United States Constitution, ratified 1804. Congress, specifically under the Constitution, is given the right to resolve, the power, the right, and the authority to resolve all electoral disputes. The Supreme Court here usurped the power of Congress. And for those conservatives who say, well, no, the court had a right to do that, just ask them, and bring a pair of earmuffs along, because the silence is going to be deafening. What case gives them that authority? What statute? What rule? What regulation? What historical precedent? There's nothing at all. They had no more right intervening in this case than I pointed out in the Des Moines Rotary Club or the Boston Symphony. They had no business doing what they did. Congress had the right to resolve this dispute. But that argument is taking hold in America. That even if we make the assumption that the court acted improperly, they had to do it, they had no choice to avoid a constitutional crisis. But they had no problem with the constitutional crisis of Congress trying to impeach President Clinton for trying to cover up a private consensual sexual affair. Those very same people. Then the other argument they use, I'm sure you've heard it, well, Mr. Bugliosi, what difference does it make what the court did? The newspaper count has shown that Bush won anyway. And they underline that word anyway by the intonation in their voice. Number one, that's not very clear at all that Bush is going to win the recount. The most recent USA Today, Miami Herald survey, May 11th, specifically said that using two standards to count votes, Bush wins. Using two other standards, Gore wins. The consortium, you've heard of that, the LA Times, Chicago Tribune, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and a couple other papers, they haven't come up with their findings yet. But let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that Bush ends up winning the recount. Totally, completely, utterly irrelevant. Why is it irrelevant? Because when you commit a crime, the bell is rung the moment you engage in your conduct. Nothing that happens thereafter can ring that bell, and it is therefore completely irrelevant. To judge these justices by the final result, rather than by their intentions at the time they engaged in their conduct, would be like, as I pointed out, exonerating someone who shoots to kill if the bullet happens to miss the victim. Or A murders B, and then some doctor says, well, B was going to die anyway in a couple days. And I guess we should forget then what A does to B. But these are the arguments that you're using for Scalia and Thomas, who doesn't even try to create the impression that he's thinking. I mean, these are not good people. They're a disgrace to the judiciary. They're a disgrace to the legal profession. But as of the moment that I'm talking to you, they have completely gotten away with it. They've completely gotten away with it at this precise moment. Despite their monumental crime, they're still seated on the highest court, obviously. They're still treated with the utmost respect by the established institutions of America, including the nation's media. They have gotten by with it so far. If they can get by with what they did, and we've taken lying down, what does that say about us?
That's right.
But I can tell you this, and it's unfortunate what I'm going to tell you, but you folks are in the extreme minority.
No.
Well, there's people that are angry. The vast majority of Americans, because of the media, they've gone on to other things. They don't want to talk about it. I know it's nice to be in this room here. We're all very supportive. I think, from my traveling around the country, that the vast majority of Americans have moved on, unfortunately. But if we keep reaching them, we can energize them. Because at one point in time, there were millions of Americans that were very, very angry about this.
Right. They're still on.
But their anger has dissipated to a certain extent, and if folks like you can get the message out. Enormous amount of evidence, I agree with you, pointing towards guilt. But let's talk just very briefly about motive. And I'm sure the things I'm going to mention, you already know this, or most of you know it. The night of the election, November 7th, Sandra Day O'Connor was at a cocktail party in Washington, D.C. with her lawyer husband, John. Dan Rather gets on the air at 8 o'clock, says that looks like Florida's going to Gore, whereupon she blurts out, "That's just terrible." She was angry, she was upset. Her husband had to explain to the guests that they had wanted to retire to Arizona. Now they're going to have to wait 4 years because she didn't want a Democratic president appointing her successor. The Wall Street Journal found 3 guests at the party to confirm the story. Newsweek found 2. They both wrote articles on it. Both the Wall Street Journal and Newsweek went to her for comment. She declined comment. Clarence Thomas's wife works for the Heritage Foundation, a very conservative Washington think tank that has assisted Governor Bush in his transition to power. Scalia, it's a well-known secret. Everyone knows, wants to become Chief Justice, and he certainly knew that if Gore got in, he would not become Chief Justice. But in addition to that, he has 2 sons that work for law firms very heavily involved in the Bush campaign. Now, under Title 28, Section 455 of the United States Code, if there's any conflict of interest or even an appearance of a conflict of interest, the justices have a legal obligation to disqualify themselves. They call it recuse themselves. These justices did not do that. Now, there's no penalty for not doing it. If you look at Title 28, it says they have to do it. It's mandatory, but if they violate it, there's no punishment. But if there is impeachment proceedings brought against them, that will be one of the articles that they should have. They had an obligation under the law to disqualify themselves, and they did not. But the main article of impeachment is this enormous breach of the public trust that may be unparalleled in the recorded annals of America. I also told Ellen on the set of the Good Morning America show, I said, "Ellen, you're a law professor, but I guarantee you are 100% wrong when you say that these people can't be impeached." She doesn't think they can. And I said, I'll tell you why you're wrong. They can't be prosecuted because to be prosecuted there has to be a crime on the books. And what they did is so far out, so unbelievable, that there was no crime on the books for them to violate it. But I said, Ellen, from Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers down through Joseph Story's commentaries on the Constitution, there's all types of historical precedent for the proposition that you can impeach a public official even if they did not violate the law. All you have to show is a substantial breach of the public trust. In fact, only one Supreme Court justice has ever been impeached. Samuel Chase, 1804, 7 articles of impeachment against him, not one alleged a violation of law. Back in those days, I guess it was the early 19th century, they would sit as justices on the Supreme Court, but I guess maybe 1 month or 2 months a year or what have you, they would go on what they called the trial circuit, and they would sit as trial judges. And this Chase apparently did things like this. He allowed some juror to sit on a jury, even though the juror had said that he'd already made up his mind. He prevented a defense attorney from calling a witness to the stand. And these were the things that the articles of impeachment were based on. So I said, Ellen, you were wrong. You do not, I mean, it's certainly better if you have a violation of law, but you do not have to have a violation of law to impeach. They are going to pay in some way for what they did, and we're also increasing the likelihood that this will never, ever happen again in America.
We all know. Jeb Bush told Papa Bush, I am going to deliver Florida at all costs. We have here tonight Greg Palast.
Yes, great.
Yeah. Greg. Did not report in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, but papers in England like the Guardian. Why? Because we have a blackout in the U.S. media. And if you want to hear the truth, we're going to hear it now. Here's Greg Palast.
I have a question for you. I mean, what is wrong with you people? I mean, why haven't you moved on? And so, and here you are. You're all standing up instead of moving on, and it forces me to make some changes in my plans. Bob was saying that he's talking in Nation magazine, and where I'm doing investigative reporting a bit here, and I was in the same issue with Vince. And he said, well, I know you don't have a lot of time to pick up on Florida. I have a feeling I'm going back. Good. Because I see people standing up. But there's a little problem with that. You just heard that my reports, I'm a special investigative reporter for the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC Television, as well as the major newspaper of Britain, The Guardian, and its Sunday paper, The Observer. Now, usually when we break a story, especially about the United States, it's automatically picked up. We are considered the primo. You know, we have all those great accents. I never got the accent, but you know, Alistair Cook and all that. So, but what happened here? Because at the top of the nightly news, we ran an investigative report, which, by the way, you can see on tape, and Lou is going to play that on video here. What Europe saw, the evidence of the theft of the election in Florida. You can watch this because you'll see the Samizdat version. But this is what people saw at the top of the nightly news in Britain and read on page 1 of the national papers about the theft of the election in Florida. And here, now I want to make one correction. The Washington Post did let me write a bit about the theft of the election in Florida. I wrote the story and printed it in Britain on the 26th of November, 21 days after the election, and the Washington Post let me put it in June. I do want to thank them. I'm sure, you know, it's one of those things that kind of fell behind the desk. Never happened. It happens all the time. And the difference was, of course, in 26 November, Al Gore had not been pushed into concession yet, and so you haven't moved on.
No.
But I want to tell you what you will see. What you will see if you watch this tape that was not meant for you to see in the United States of America. And one of the first things you'll see is a guy named Clayton Roberts. He's kind of like this bull-necked, gentle-talking man. He is the director of the Florida Department of Elections. And I went to go see him, and I took my BBC camera crew. And by the way, I had a crew filming me from Danny Schechter, we have here, one of the great directors of America, who was trying to show American reporters how you actually should cover the election. So he's filming me filming. We're all in Robert's office. And all I wanted to do was show the director of the Florida Department of Elections a document. I'm sorry I don't have it with me, because I don't know if it would scare you, but it scared him. And what happened was, I began to show him a document that said confidential across the top. It said trade secret across the top. You're not supposed to see this document. I happen to have it. I just wanted to ask him about it. He ripped off his microphone, did the 50-yard dash across all the video cables, and locked himself in his office before pointing his finger at us and saying, "Turn off that camera." And then, very politely, suddenly these big guys with these Smokey Bear hats showed up, and our camera crew was escorted out by the state troopers out of the state office building. Now, what was so frightening that he didn't want to see it and answer to it? And what's so frightening that American viewers can't see it or talk about it? It's a document about something called the Voter Purge. This guy Roberts, before he was head of the Florida Department of Elections, see, everyone concentrates on Katherine Harris. I'm going to tell you about this. She's just the middle of the sandwich. Below her is Clayton Roberts, and above her is someone named Jeb Bush, who coincidentally is related to the man who's in the White House. You have to understand the relationship between these two before you can understand Katherine Harris. Because what Vince was talking to you about is a Supreme Court decision based on a very close, apparent vote. But it wouldn't have gotten to the court. They wouldn't have had to soil their robes publicly if the vote, in fact, were not so officially close. So how did that happen? It didn't start 3 days after the vote. It didn't start with the Miami Republican lobbyist riots. It began 2 years before when Clayton Roberts was in the state legislature and crafted a law. And by the way, you will not read this in any American paper at all or see it on American television. He crafted a law to cleanse the voter rolls of people who shouldn't be allowed to vote, in particular, felons. Oh, by the way, I did want to say one thing in terms of why you are not seeing it in the U.S. I asked about that. I asked, well, why aren't you running my story? And they said, well, the committee's decided that the American people have determined the election is over. And I said, the committee? The committee? And then I realized, well, I wasn't supposed to ask about the committee if I wanted to try to return home from exile and report in America. So I said, okay, I'm not going to ask about the committee. So I'm going to tell you what the committee decided you don't want to know. So this guy moves, he sets up a law to cleanse the vote of people who shouldn't be voting. We don't, illegal voters shouldn't be voting. People who've committed felonies, mother stabbers and father rapers and all those things, and they shouldn't vote in Florida. And they got thousands of names, and first they got a list from Texas of 8,000 names, and the problem with the 8,000 felons from Texas who moved to Florida and couldn't vote is that the 8,000 Texans were all innocent, and none of them had committed any crime. But they were guilty of one.
Hold on. I heard one of them had a speeding ticket.
Well, actually, and their governor named Mr. George W. Actually, he had a misdemeanor for drunk driving, and everyone else on the list also were people who just had misdemeanors like their governor. But there was something interesting about this list. They supposedly corrected the list and came up with 56,000 names of real felons, real criminals. And of course, the American media dropped the story. It was in the back ends of business pages about, oh, there was this computer error. And I was kind of curious about the computer error after the election was so darn close, or maybe it wasn't close. And I wanted to know whether it was close. So I called some Florida elections supervisors, and one of them said, we've been waiting for someone to call us. And there were 2,000 media people down in Florida, and not one of them asked the election supervisors what had happened. And one of the election supervisors said, we've been waiting. And I said, I just have kind of one question about this list. Well, two questions. First, are these felons? They said, nope. I said, no. And I said, let me ask one other question. I'm just guessing. How many were black? And the guy put the statistician from Hillsborough County said, I counted up the names. 54% of the people on the purge list to lose their civil rights, their right to vote in the presidential election, 54% were African American. Oh, and he said, I thought that was unusual because in our county, in Hillsborough, which is Tampa, only 11% of the population is African American. And so people losing their votes, over half of them were African American. And 93% of African Americans in Florida voted for Gore. Okay, so no connection. This was all error. So Salon.com, I did say there was an American outlet. Salon.com, which is the big internet magazine, which is fighting for its life, gave me a team of people to send out throughout Florida and go county by county and see how many people lost their votes who shouldn't lose their votes. Now, our first count from Salon, we published this quickly, was 7,000 people on that list were innocent of any crime except being black. And then I talked to the company. There was a private company. No other state had ever done this. They hired a private company to give them a list of names to pull off the voter rolls. A private company named Database Technology, part of Choice Point, which is run by people like Ken Langone, who was the chairman of Rudy Giuliani's, or he was treasurer of Rudy Giuliani's Senate campaign. I'm going, okay, no connection. And then, I'm not making any connections here. I'm just telling you the facts. I'm a reporter. I'm not a polemicist. I'm giving you the facts, which you're not allowed to have in the United States, but we can.
How much money did they pay them?
And they paid them. Oh, man, that got into very good. Someone's holding up 4. There was another company that was doing the work for the state, which got $50,000. Then they fired them. They replaced them. It was a good bargain. Their Republican company was getting $4 million. And I called the $4 million company, the Republican company, and I said, I think you got 7,000 people on this list who aren't criminals, and they weren't allowed to vote. They were targeted for not voting, and they said, oh, that's pretty good. 15% wrong. That's only that's 85% correct. And I said, but it's 7,000 votes. I mean, half of them were black. I mean, that's the election presidency of the United States. I said, well, that's 85%. It's not so bad. But then I worry, as soon as someone says that enough innocent people were removed from the voter rolls, and that's okay because it was 85% correct, immediately led me to conclude that it wasn't 85% correct. So then I went to Tallahassee and talked to Ion Sancho, the county election supervisor. He said he went name by name by name. He's the only guy that did it, name by name by name, to see, are these felons? Is John Smith of Tallahassee the same John Smith that knocked off a 7-Eleven in Utah in 1964? And he said, you know what I found? 19 out of 20 names were people who were innocent, but not innocent of being African American. So, what was happening here? If you looked at these purge lists, oh, by the way, how do we know that they were African American? I'm sorry I didn't bring a purge list with me, but the purge lists have names, birth date, gender, and then it says white, black, black, white, white, black, black, white. And you go, is this a South African election, or what is this? What is this list? And then I find out, well, actually, this was from the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was meant to protect people, to protect black voters. So what they did was, in Florida, they marked people's registration by race so that the federal government could know if Florida was taking away their right to vote. But if you're really sharp and you have some really good computers, it was like a cruise missile. Black, purge, and it was a very sophisticated program. So then I went back to the $4 million Republican company and I said, lots of black names purged. And the spokesman said, we didn't use race as a search criterion. Our missiles didn't search for black. But then I found a letter, which he forgot to mention, that went to the county supervisor saying, we know we've made a lot of mistakes on this list, but it's all corrected now because we're using gender, name, and race as a match criterion. Remember I just said he didn't use race as a search criterion, it was a match criterion. So now 95% of 56,000 names, not all of them were knocked off. Because, for example, Linda Howell, who was one of the election supervisors, when her name was on the list, she decided that she was not, in fact, a felon and didn't remove herself from the voter purge list. So we don't know how many, but BBC's demographers, some of the best demographers in the nation and the world, figured Al Gore lost about 22,000 votes that way. Forget the 154, the 357 official votes. We were talking thousands who lost their vote before the election, whose crime was being black, in which they took computers and basically put launched Jim Crow into cyberspace. So you'll hear more on the purge. I'm not going any more into it, but just two quick things is that, so I took my crew to Florida, and you're not hearing this, by the way. Oh, did you read this in the time? Washington Post, again, in June, thanks a lot. After the U.S. Civil Rights Commission took my material, and the Nation gave it a home, and they said, this is the first hard evidence of systematic racial bias in the vote in Florida that we found, and they wrote the core of their report, that this is how the election was taken. And we've gotten more material since. And the document that Clayton Roberts didn't want to see is that this company was paid $4 million originally to verify that each name was correct by making telephone calls and using their big databases. They were paid $4 million, almost all of it, to make phone calls. And you know how many phone calls they made? You guessed it. And but they got the checks, because I have copies of the checks. They were paid not to do the work, to make sure that there were thousands of people who couldn't vote that day. So then I took the camera crew down, and we saw something interesting. One of the offices, after I was literally escorted out of Mr. Roberts' office, said, well, let's go across the street to the county supervisor's office in the mostly white county of Leon, which is Tallahassee. And let's just look at a voting machine. And there's a voting machine, and it was a paper ballot, and you stick the ballot into the machine. And they're very proud of this in Tallahassee. You stick the ballot into the machine, and if you've mismarked the ballot, it comes right back into your hands. You know, like those dollar bill machines, you have a bad buck, and it comes right back. Well, if you misvote in that white county of Tallahassee, your vote comes back, you get a new ballot. The elections workers say, oh, you made an extra mark, or you did it wrong. Now, I said, gee, that's a great system. Everyone have that? He said, not next door in Leon County. He said, well, I'm just guessing. Is Leon County like a lot of African Americans? And they said, it's about the blackest county in Florida. And they have a machine that looks exactly like ours. It's the exact same machine, the exact same paper ballot, but if the people in the black county make a wrong mark on their ballot, the machine goes, eats it, the vote isn't counted, the ballot is voided, and you don't know it. So that in the white county, only 1 out of 200 ballots was not counted. 1 out of 200. In the black county, 1 out of 8 ballots was not counted. So when Vince tells you about the Supreme Court fight, he's talking about the fight to count those ballots. And were those ballots difficult to determine? The question was there a way to determine the intent of the voter? I saw some ballots. You want to know what they said on them? Some said, had a check mark next to Al Gore. And then it said write-in candidate's name. Now, it meant for the write-in, but it was very confusing on the ballot. And some people wrote Al Gore. So someone checked Al Gore and wrote Al Gore. The question was, what is the intent of the voter? This is what the Supreme Court was saying. That ballot should not be counted. That's what, when Vince is talking about these legal arguments, I want you to understand what the particulars are. He's saying that someone who checks Al Gore and writes Al Gore, that vote does not count for Al Gore. So, yeah, those are, there's all this terminology of overvotes and undervotes, but I gotta tell you, in Europe, I'm gonna wrap it here, and you can ask me just a couple questions, or Vince, is that in Europe, they didn't know about overvotes, undervotes, moving on. After I ran my reports on the evening news, people stopped me and would say, well, Bush has to resign now, right? Democracy, America's the home of democracy. So, the election was fixed, and okay, he's got to resign. Well, no, we've moved on. And they say, well, kind of, what do you move on from democracy? I mean, what's the next step after democracy? I mean, you don't move on from democracy. You try to move towards democracy. And they pointed out that there were 2 other elections in last year, in which the final outcome was jiggered at the last minute in a funny count of the votes. One was Slobodan Milosevic won by jiggering the votes. He did win in the official, Catherine Harris declared him winner. And as the last votes came in from the rural areas, and he won, and the people went into the streets. And he moved on. And then in Peru, the quasi-dictator Fujimori, suddenly the election count was stopped. It was restarted, and suddenly he wins the count. He wins the count out of the rural area. And Catherine Harris said, esto es Fujimori el presidente again. But then pretty soon he moved on. because people went into the streets.
Same thing's gonna happen
But,
here.
well, now you have here a voter march.
Same
So,
thing's gonna happen
now,
Peru.
the thing is, what do we do? Do we move on, or do we stand firm? So, it's very interesting to see a group of people standing firm. So I'll take any questions you might have.
Can you talk a little bit about the stories you've written about the Derek Bush thing?
Can I, without being sued? Okay, I usually don't promote these things. www.gregpalast.com. I'm not going to sell you a t-shirt or any of that.
Greg with one
But
G.
when I first wrote, somewhere in here, I wrote a story. When I broke the story of the purge of voters in Florida, and that it was mostly black voters, that was the second part of a two-part story. It was the second half, the bottom of the page. The top of the page was under the heading, "The Best Democracy Money Can Buy." Because how many people here know this? That George Bush daddy, after he left the White House, went to work for a Canadian gold mining company. Now, not many people in America know that. And I thought, gee, that's interesting. And I thought, gee, maybe people in the world ought to know about that question. He went to work for a gold mining company named Barrick Gold. Now, before he went to work for the gold mining company Barrick Gold's chairman, who got some funding from a guy named Adnan Khashoggi, who you may know as the bag man in the arms Iran-Contra case, whom, by the way, George Bush pardoned. And so Mr. Pardon gave money to Mr. Goldfinger out of Canada, and Mr. Goldfinger and his organization, Barrick Gold Mining, put a claim on an ore body in Nevada, the biggest gold mine on the planet, and they were given the ownership rights. They perfected their claim, is the technical term, but given ownership rights to this gold ore, $10 billion worth of ore, for less than $10,000 payment to the U.S. Treasury, under a very unusual and extraordinary arrangement, an expedited procedure for doing this deal, and it ran through. Before Bush left office, they got this $10 billion mine for $10,000 U.S. Treasury. Now, they've complained that I don't mention the fact that they spent money to dig the ore out of the ground and buy other rights, etc. So they spent some other money. We didn't hand them the gold bars. They had to dig it out. And then George Bush ended up on the International Advisory Board of this company, where he did such tasks for the company, such positive democracy-promoting tasks as writing letters to the dictator Suharto to please give these guys part of a gold concession. And that's what your ex-president was doing with his time and his Rolodex, which you built, and also, by the way, the ex-head of the CIA, which was his job. So what happened was that I made a mistake in that I was wondering why Americans didn't have this information. Now I found out is that if you write this out, you get sued. And so what happened is that George Bush's employer had filed a massive and vicious suit against the Guardian and Observer newspapers, which ran the combined story of Bush's money and the purge of the Florida voters. BBC continued the story on the Florida purge, but as of today, the story has been removed from all public records in Britain. So I'm just telling you the one thing you have to say, God bless America, we do have a First Amendment, and it can make you a patriot for the moment. So what I want to tell you is it's not easy to do. Go to my website where you can read more of the stories of the voter purge, the story that was in The Nation and Salon.com, and you can also read A Blacklist Burning for Bush, which is more of Catherine Harris story written there, and there will be more to come, and especially because I know that I'm working with Global Vision right now and others but to try to finish a film and see if we can force American television to play the story rather than the BS.
Yay, Carla.
Okay, by the way, it is a nice article in MediaChannel.org called "Silence of the Lambs: The Election Story Never Told." And I'll just tell one anecdote from it, which is that CBS TV News said, "Can we have a little piece of your story, please?" Because they don't do their own investigative stuff. They're only a multi-billion-dollar operation, so they come to BBC. "Can we take some?" I said, "Okay." There's one little piece I haven't looked at. Jeb Bush himself, out of the governor's office, had issued instructions not to register people who had moved to Florida from other states, who had sometime in their life had some type of criminal record, but had the right to vote in Florida. 2 courts told the governor, you can't take away civil rights because someone moves to Florida. You don't lose your civil rights just because he moves to Florida. And the governor very quietly issued a letter saying, "Well, I'm governor, you lose your civil rights." Can you hear? And at any rate, so I gave it to CBS, including some information and documentation. But I said, it needs a little more work to nail this thing down. CBS calls me 2 nights later, and I said, "So did you run the report?" They said, "No, I'm sorry, your story didn't stand up." I said, "No, hello? Okay, maybe it's my pride. I'm there, BBC investigative report." I said, "Well, tell me. I don't want to waste time on this investigation. How do you know that Jeb Bush didn't do this?" They said, "Well, we called Jeb Bush's office, and they said that they had the right, and they told us that it was okay." And I said,
Oh my God.
"Why didn't I think of doing that?" I can save a lot of time on my investigations if I simply, "Jeb Bush, did you steal the election?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Sorry to bother you." So anyway, that's how CBS television ran their investigation of the Florida theft of the election. And so we're trying to do it a different way, so maybe apartment by apartment, website by website. Go to www. By the way, BBC does have the story online. If you go to my website, you can see the videotape that BBC made. It goes right into their computers, so that if you're starved of the information, you can get it.
It's very important what we're doing. It's important that not only do you come here and support what we're doing here, but it's important for you to go back to your own apartment buildings, back to your own businesses, and stop being the quiet people that we are. We have to make noise, and we have to raise money. Right now, the Republicans have double our war chest. That's a scary thought to me, because I've run a lot of different activist things, and over the years, it really comes down to who spends the most money. That's the unfortunate thing. We have got to start digging into our pockets and really making a difference here. And we've got to do it among our friends, the people in our buildings, the people we come into contact, our website people that you have on your email list. Actually leave this with a new, invigorated spirit.
We have
do
to
something
continue,
worthwhile.
and we have to coalesce, and we have to get organized. So please, many new faces, thank you all for coming. At least spread the word and try to do what you can, and it will take money, that's true. We've been digging in our own pockets here, and it spitballs against a battleship. Okay, so don't let anybody fool yourself. This is a massive, organized effort. I think one woman called it a vast right-wing conspiracy one time. She had that right, okay? It's time for the people of America to take back what's theirs, and that's the right to vote. Thank you.